All right, let's jump right into this explainer and explore our channel's namesake, hidden reality. We go through our everyday lives completely trusting the ground beneath our feet, the people we love, the basic laws of physics. We just assume tomorrow is going to look pretty much exactly like today. But what happens when that trust is totally broken? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the hidden reality that is literally lying just beneath the surface of our everyday lives.
Seriously, ask yourself, what actually happens when everyday life defies all logic? It is so incredibly easy to just brush off strange tales as fiction or, urban legends. I get it. We all want to believe the world makes sense. But today, we're going to walk through 3 fully documented, reputable cases reported in media outlets all over the world where the mundane, predictable world just suddenly shattered. These aren't fairy tales, guys. These are moments when reality itself seemed to glitch.
3 documented cases. 3 shattered realities. As you'll see, our journey today is going to escalate from some terrifying human malice to a tragically absurd misunderstanding, and finally to a complete anomaly that outright breaks the laws of physics. So, buckle up. It's a steep drop into the unknown.
Act 1. The Beauty Influencer. We're starting off in Munich, Germany on August 15, 2022. Meet 24-year-old beauty influencer Sheraban K. She's sitting in her childhood bedroom, which is this literal time capsule of her high school days, right down to the brightly colored pillows and old photos on the walls. She's carefully applying her makeup, getting ready for what seems like a really exciting secret meeting. But behind this perfectly curated influencer facade, Sheraban was actually hiding a deeply desperate situation.
See, Sheraban was trapped. Her family belonged to the Yazidi faith, which strictly forbids divorce. Her marriage was failing miserably, so she had moved back home. But her parents and her in-laws absolutely refused to let her leave her husband. But, secretly, she'd started a forbidden romance with a young guy named Shakir. She desperately wanted to escape her marriage and run away with him, but the walls were closing in fast. So to get out, the two of them devised a plan.
And let me tell you, this plot was shockingly cold and calculated. They didn't just plan to run away in the night. No, they planned to totally fake Sheraban's death so she could assume a brand new identity. Step 1. Scour Instagram to find another beauty influencer who looked exactly like Sheraban. Step 2. Lure this woman, a woman named Khadidja, to a meeting with a promise of free beauty products. Step 3. Once Khadidja got into Sheraban's Mercedes, they pulled out knives and brutally murdered her. And finally, Step 4. Plant the car and the body near Sheraban's estranged husband's apartment to frame him while the two lovers just fled into a new life.
So that very night, right around midnight in the city of Ingolstadt, Sheraban's frantic parents went out looking for her. They ended up spotting her Mercedes parked off this quiet street near the river. When her mother peered into the dark back seat, she made an absolutely horrifying discovery. There was a lifeless body, stiff with rigor mortis, that had been stabbed more than 50 times in an absolute frenzy. The parents were completely fooled by the physical resemblance, and they firmly believed they were looking at their own daughter, Sheraban.
Now this perfectly illustrates the concept of the doppelganger. The victim in the back of that car wasn't Sheraban at all, it was Khadidja. Khadidja was an exact physical replica of Sheraban. They looked so incredibly identical that even Sheraban's own mother and father were utterly convinced that the dead woman in the car was their child. At this point, the plan was working perfectly. The husband was brought in for questioning, the police were investigating a domestic homicide, and Sheraban and Shakir were completely free.
But there was a fatal flaw in this ultimate deception. While the facial features were identical enough to fool grieving parents, they absolutely could not fool science. When the medical examiner conducted the official autopsy, they made a massive discovery. Yes, the body looked exactly like Sheraban, but the dental records were completely different. The teeth just didn't match. This single scientific fact totally unraveled the hidden reality Sheraban had constructed, eventually leading police to arrest both her and Shakir, resulting in life sentences for both of them.
All right, moving on to Act 2. A Voice from the Casket. The setting here is Lyon, France, in August of 1987. A 57-year-old widow named Claudia Cessie is attending her husband's solemn funeral. Her husband had died suddenly just a few days prior, and Claudia was still in that deep, heavy fog of grief, secretly hoping she'd get a call from the morgue saying there had been some terrible mistake.
Picture the scene with me for a second. It's a quiet, historic church. Family and friends are all wearing black, dabbing their eyes with handkerchiefs. A musician is playing a very slow, solemn hymn on a pipe organ. The music fades out, right? The church goes totally silent. The priest steps up to the pulpit to begin the mass.
And then, a sudden, muffled sound echoes through the stone walls. It was loud enough to stop the priest dead in his tracks. People start to gasp. The sound was coming directly from inside the closed casket.
That muffled sound quickly became distinct. It was a man's voice, muffled by the thick wood of the coffin, clearly saying, "Let me out of here." I mean, absolute screaming chaos erupted in the church. The priest, a guy who had presided over hundreds of funerals, was just frozen in terror. Mourners were running in every direction, completely unable to process the impossible reality that a dead man was calling out from his own coffin.
But right in the middle of all that panic, the widow, Claudia, reacted completely differently. She shat right up to her feet. To her, this wasn't a nightmare at all. This was the exact miracle she had been praying for. Her husband was alive. Overwhelmed by this terrifying, sudden joy, she actually began to sprint toward the coffin to free him. But the sheer emotional shock was simply too much for her heart to take. After taking only a few steps, Claudia clutched her chest, collapsed to the church floor, and suffered a massive fatal heart attack right there in the aisle.
Now, the tragic absurdity of this situation is what actually happened when the priest finally rushed over and forced the casket open. The husband was obviously completely dead. He hadn't spoken a single word. Instead, a friend of the husband who was attending the funeral happened to be a highly skilled ventriloquist. Seeing the heavy grief in the room, this guy thought he could lighten the mood with a spectacularly misguided prank by throwing his voice, making it sound like his dead buddy was joking from the grave. And, well, it worked way too well. The illusion of reality was so overwhelmingly strong it literally killed Claudia, and amazingly, because ventriloquism isn't actually a crime, the friend faced absolutely no criminal charges.
Finally, we arrive at Act 3, Defying Gravity and Logic. The date is March 18, 1963. We are in Yorkshire, England. It's a totally normal morning, just before first period. A 16-year-old girl named Eileen Welch is holding an armful of books, happily chatting with her friends outside her high school, totally surrounded by dozens of other students just waiting for the morning bell.
Without any warning whatsoever, Eileen suddenly began to scream. Her friends watched in absolute horror as Eileen just began to rise into the air. There were no wires, no machines, literally nothing lifting her. She was inexplicably pulled upwards by some phantom force, soaring 30 feet into the sky. She just hung there, suspended in midair, screaming in terror, while the entire courtyard of students looked up at her in shock. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the force vanished, and Eileen came violently crashing back down to the earth. Despite doctors rushing to save her, the massive internal injuries were just too severe. Eileen Welch died just 2 hours later.
Now, I know when you hear a story like this, your absolute first instinct is to assume it's just a crazy urban legend, but consider this number: 37. Police detectives rushed to the school and immediately separated all the witnesses. They interviewed 37 different students and teachers who were in that courtyard, and all 37 of them told the exact same impossible story. They all watched Eileen rise into the air entirely on her own, and to this day, decades later, not a single one of those 37 witnesses has ever changed their story. The sheer volume of unwavering proof is pretty staggering.
Desperate for any kind of rational explanation, the police brought in top meteorologists. They basically assumed this had to be some freak weather event, maybe a localized mini tornado. But the meteorologists did the math, and they concluded that to lift a 16-year-old girl 30 feet into the air in the manner described, it would require sustained wind speeds of at least 110 miles per hour. But weather records confirmed there were absolutely no winds even remotely close to that speed anywhere in England that morning. The weather was entirely, completely normal.
But here is the ultimate, chilling anomaly of this entire case. Even if we pretend a freak, invisible, 110-mile-per-hour gust of wind somehow touched down in that exact courtyard, it still makes zero scientific sense. Think about it. Eileen was standing in a crowd, shoulder to shoulder with her friends. Yet she was the only person affected. Nobody else was blown over, no one else's books went flying. It was a targeted, phantom force that defied every single known law of physics. To this day, her death remains a completely unsolved scientific impossibility. So, as we step back and look at these three cases, they perfectly illustrate the fragile nature of our world. We saw how a desperate woman literally weaponized her own face to murder a doppelganger and cheat society. We saw how a perfectly timed acoustic illusion convinced a grieving widow her husband was still alive, stopping her own heart in the process. And finally, we saw a teenage girl plucked straight from the earth by an invisible hand, leaving 37 witnesses and modern science completely speechless.
Which leaves us here, at the end of our explainer, with one final question to ponder. How fragile is your perception of the hidden reality around you? We really like to think we see the world exactly as it is, but as we've learned today, whether it's a hidden motive, a trick of the ear, or a massive rupture in the very fabric of physics, the reality you trust might just be an illusion waiting to shatter. Keep your eyes open, and never stop questioning what lies beneath.